da ka da ka di ki ne tha da din ta ti da ka di ki ne tha da din ta ti da ka di ki ne tha da din ta
welcome to our podcast. We're so happy to be here sharing this with you. I think we'll begin with some introductions, and seeing as I'm talking, I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Karen and I'm from Theiya Arts. I'm a Bharatanatyam dancer and I'm originally from Ireland.
Hi, I'm Himadri Madan. I'm basically from India, an Indian classical dancer. I am studying in UK, doing my master's in choreography at Trinity Laban.
Hi, I'm Nandini. I'm also from India. I'm studying at the University of Edinburgh as a psychotherapist and a researcher, and I'm also an Indian classical dancer and a choreographer.
Hi, I'm Ingrid. I work at the University of Edinburgh. I am not a dancer, but I appreciate it. I love dance. I'm a researcher and I look at sexual and reproductive health and rights more broadly. And I'm from Canada, but live in Scotland.
Hi, I'm Agumoni. I am a bioethicist, also at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm interested in questions of global health justice, global health ethics, public health ethics, and especially issues of gender justice. And I'm also a student of dance.
And from the point of view of inclusivity, we should probably mention this is Barry the cat who made them go during our webcast today. Why don't we start by talking a little bit about our project? Agumoni, would you like to just give a bit of an overview of our project and what brings us here today?
Yeah, absolutely. So from our perspective, Ingrid and mine, so we are both part of the Center for Biomedicine, Self and Society. And within that, one of the themes we look at is called Beyond Sex. So looking at a variety of questions around sex, gender, health, well-being, in relation to questions of ethics, social questions, questions of justice, and so on. And within that theme, we wanted to create a space that would allow for reflection, reading, and dialogue around questions and concepts of decolonization, of anti-colonial practice and methods, anti-imperial thought and anti-racist movements, and so on. Also, of course, in relation to the context of gender, of sex and health. And it is in this context that we sort of came to this collaboration with Agnya Movement and Theiya Arts. And within that, the session that this arises from is a session where we discussed and read post-colonial feminists. So we were reading Chandra Thautparhe Mohanty and Gayatri Spivak, as well as feminist fiction authors, so Ismat Chugtai and Mahashweta Devi. So Ismat Chugtai's Lihav specifically, and Mahashweta Devi's Draupadi. So these were short stories that we were also reading in the context of exploring South Asian and post-colonial feminist thoughts. And so we came together to discuss and explore themes related to the gendered body, to identity, in relation to expectations and oppression and violence imposed either by social norms and institutions, but also by the carceral state. So that's sort of the background to the beginning of this project. Ingrid, would you like to add any thoughts to that?
Yeah, I think you've covered it well. I don't know if you want me to talk about the arts-based interests that we have.
Yeah, that would be great.
So Agumoni and I share an interest and love of the arts, and I think in both a kind of personal capacity, but also in a professional capacity. And I think one of the early conversations I remember with Aga was actually we were at some academic event, but we started talking about Akram Khan's dance work and that what we'd seen and how we both were really quite passionate about dance. And I think linking this to kind of our academic work, we're both, and I think the possibilities of what arts can bring to these conversations about gender justice, about decolonization, about health and well-being, and about changing, about activism, are really important. I've been involved in a number of arts-based projects where we look at how the arts have been used in a number of ways to express what perhaps words don't always express. And when I say that, I don't mean to exclude written work as arts-based work, but I think the visual, I think the performance, I think the sound art can be really powerful and can sometimes convey, or not just convey, ideas that aren't as well expressed verbally or orally, but actually can push us to think past those boundaries that we work within. So beyond sex, the kind of theme that we work within is really interested in exploring and collaborating with artists to think through some of the key ideas and key issues at stake. So we're really excited to be working with you to think through some of these ideas and to explore how can we have an interdisciplinary dialogue between not just a bioethicist and a sociologist, but with dancers, with performance artists who each bring your own stories, your own experiences to the subjects that we're talking about. So this is, for us, a little experimental, but I think that's always a fun thing to do. So that's where what Beyond Sex is trying to do, and that's why we're all here today.
And I think that kind of leads us nicely into talking about the inspiration from our side around the creation of this project. And maybe you'd like to speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think Agu and Ingrid have really covered very well the topics that we have been thinking about. I think this was in making for some time, because we're all classical dancers, yes, but we all come from our diverse backgrounds. We've had different trainings, as we have 8 classical dancers in India, and we all have learned different dance forms with different teachers in different parts of the world. And I think those experiences and our experiences as women was something we've been looking at for quite some time and trying to express things through art. I think our activist side and the performer and the choreographer side has always been interspersed. So as Ingrid said, we saw this thing as an opportunity for interdisciplinary dialogue, because we are researchers as well with our university. We are working in arts, and we've been trying to talk about things which are less spoken about, or let's say it does not really reach people as much through just written work and through books and stuff sometimes, which because it's like, I wouldn't say it's classified knowledge, but it's really hard sometimes to come around that kind of knowledge, which I think art can bridge that gap of sorts. So when we started having this conversation with the center and everything, the main aim was to bring everything that's happening in the academic fields in the terms of research, and all the material that we have can be conveyed and reaches larger set of people, and the dialogue becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, so that hopefully it becomes very inclusive and we can have more people who join us in the process. Anything you both would like to add?
I think yeah, you've covered that well, but for me there's also something about that kind of straddling different worlds and arts-based research in that, kind of to think about how can we know differently, what do we know differently when we start working differently. For me, like I am as a researcher also kind of thinking about something similar of gendered identities of Indian women. And then in the artistic work that we do, we are always kind of around the same kind of topics and ideas. To sort of bring the two things together, for me, it opens up a different way of thinking and a different way of how we can even engage in research and how we can bridge those two worlds and what that might do to the kind of knowledge we are creating and the kind of work we're doing. I suppose that is also a really important part of this project for me.
And Karen, what do you think about
Yeah,
this?
I think for me, it's interesting because when you are reading a lot of stuff, everything is happening up here, and the possibility of making all of the reflections and the material a more embodied experience, then different things come out of it. You start thinking about things or observing things in a different way. And I think hopefully also when people watch and see rather than just thinking and reading, perhaps there's a new insight will emerge. Yeah. It was a very interesting process. Ago, you already mentioned, you spoke about the reading group, the Beyond Sex reading group. Would you like to say a little bit about why these particular texts were chosen for this collaboration?
Yes, absolutely. So within that reading group, we are trying to make sure that we read some of the sort of what we might think are foundational texts in intersectional, in decolonial, post-colonial feminist literature. So, and in this particular instance, we were looking at post-colonial feminists, and two of the sort of key names in the post-colonial feminist literature. We had many to choose from, of course, but we chose Mohanty and Spivak as two names that many people will have heard of in the academy, as sort of some of the sort of foundational thinking around what the post-colonial thinking brings to global, to transnational feminist movement, to transnational feminist thinking. And that was really important because as feminists, we're trained and we have backgrounds in sort of different kinds of thinking, cultural and disciplinary contexts. So it's for us, it was really important to make sure that we don't always go through, don't always just stick to what we know as the canon because of certain disciplines that we come from and so on. So it was important for us to sort of break that canon by going to other disciplines, to other areas, to other contexts, to other geographical, political and social contexts, which also brings us sort of out of our own comfort zone as well. So Mohanty and Spivak are important figures in this area. But also as part of this reading group, what we're trying to do is to, each time we do read academic texts, we also go to fictional texts. And we've done this with every time we've gone to specific kinds of feminist thinking. And this time it was, for us, it was important to get authors who subvert some of the sort of established notions and thinking in this area. And we thought Juktai and Mahashweta Devi were important figures in this area. Lihaf talks again about the subversion of social norms. And Draupadi is, the story Draupadi is based on the original story of Draupadi in the Mahabharata, where Draupadi's assault and uncovering of her clothing is part of the assault, and what that means in terms of power and gender and sexuality and so on, and that how that is then transformed to talk about the resistance against the powers exerted by the state in revolutionary contexts. So in this context, in the Naxalite movement in India. So these were some of the sort of the thoughts we had in choosing those texts. Yeah, so this is how we came together for the reading group, and then had a subsequent discussion after the reading group regarding our thoughts and sort of interpretation and experience of the reading. And then Agnya movement and Theiya Arts then decided to take this back to think about a performance piece on this. I don't know if you'd like to say something a little bit more about the process behind that.
Yeah, so for us it was more of our experience of being in the reading group, but also being part of those discussions, and what came up for us through that, and what that evoked in us with our own experiences. So we took what was coming up for us, our experiences, and what it was making us think of, to kind of have movement explorations with. And it did not obviously start as the video that has been the end product. It started as a kind of random discussions of themes, and then of what it actually comes down to for us, to very condensed versions of broad abstract discussions, I suppose. And then the end product is kind of an autoethnographic response of our personal experiences, interspersed with how that acts as a mirror for discursive and societal issues that we're talking about here. I think that was our process through it.
I think that's about it. That's what we did.
Can I ask, actually, and it's one of the things I'm interested to know, is you presented 3 individual pieces that each of you did and showed it as a whole. Did you each go away and develop the piece and then bring that to the group, or did you all of you work on each of the pieces?
I think it happened in stages. So the first stage was we all got together. We spoke about what came up for us in the reading groups, the basic themes and stuff. And then we went away with our own themes. And then we got back together again to discuss how we feel like interpreting and translating it in movement, or as you've seen, we've used a lot of digital support right now. So how did we actually translate it in imagery more than just movement? And I think then we kind of went away to develop that a little bit. We had our own discussions. There was a lot of bouncing off each other, a lot of dialogue. And
because as we were chatting, the predominant themes were kind of rising to the surface, and the more we talked through what was our response, the more it was like, oh, this is kind of what you're thinking. This is what, and then as you said, we went away. We had a little think. But the creating part was all together.
So we came back from the studio. Like, that was the first time we ever entered the studio, and then we started moving, and then we created. I mean, we entered the studio because thanks to lockdown, we were doing all of this online till now.
And I think for me, the process was not so as clean as and structured. I think for me, it was just like, I really did not know what I was saying. I was kind of like having random spurts of words, like, loss, fragmentation. I don't know what I'm saying. And I'm really annoyed at having to, or I'm really annoyed at the implication of Indian classical dancing, that I have to do maybe Indian classical dancing. So it came up with a lot of things. And I think mine was created like in the process, almost like I still remember while editing going like, this is what I want here. I want to begin with this, and then this is what I want to happen here. So it was more, I had random movement pieces, and then somehow the creation of the video happened in process. So it was very mixed up. And I think that was
I think that was a very important bit, because of the digital element. I would say the major part of the choreography happened during the editing, at least for these are 2 pieces. But I think Karen's was more in the space.
Yeah, that's true.
True. So that was the difference here. For Karen, it was more in the space, whereas the choreographic process was after we had the clips.
Because I kind of just did random videos, like I'm going to move, and I want like all I knew was that I wanted videos of like really fragmented videos of the body and of the movement, and that's all I knew. And then from there it kind of
and for you, I think the same words kept coming up, like resistance, fragmentation, layers,
loss, visibility.
So all of these words were there they were present throughout the process. And it was gathering the material, and then slowly it was coming together into what you see.
Thanks. That's really helpful to hear more about your creative process, because we're much more on the academic and ideas side, but having you putting it into movement is really really important for us to hear about how that happens. So thank you.
Thank you.
I think maybe now might be a nice time to hear your reflections on our creative response to the material of the reading group.
I don't know, Ingrid, would you like to go first?
Yeah, happy to go first. So thank you for putting this together. I really enjoyed the 3 pieces, but also as we've discussed the whole of the piece, what the whole of the piece does. I think it's hard to pick out kind of particular issues because they all do such different things, but the idea of what is the story I see, which if I can refer back to the one of the readings we did for the reading group, which I'm going to get the name wrong, but the quilt, because I read it in translation and focused in on the English, but for me that piece was really interesting because it was a story about two lesbians and about the narrator who didn't see that they were in a relationship, even though everyone around them in the household did see this. And so what is seen and what is not allowed to be seen. So I think all three pieces really picked up on what lies behind the veneer or the image, the visual. I think that the first piece that you did, Himadri, with the kind of the different photo shoots, and then the kind of the ones that go in closer to your body and show the parts of your body that don't appear in the image, and what that does. I think that the role of the digital in playing in that, where kind of historically actually the digital has allowed us to see more closely into what we look like and what we are. So but at the same time it's also used to hide and to cover and to filter. And so how this technology actually allows you to play with that and contrast that. I think that I loved I'm just going to talk about generally with no kind of no themes or points really, if that's okay. You can edit this out, of course, if it's rambling. But the second piece, Karen, I loved the use of the music and the kind of moving to the rhythm of the music to putting on and to slowly building your ensemble, and the movement was brilliant. And then the mirroring at the end I really enjoyed. So I think again what goes into creating these images is what the first two pieces I think were really engaging with. I thought from my perspective, what does it mean to look a certain way or to be that dancer, and to what preparation goes into it, but what we don't see and what is expected to be on stage. What kind of sociologist Goffman would talk about front stage and backstage, but that's we can talk about that. And I loved the final piece as well. I really loved what you did with I think the digital in all of this has been really exciting. And I think when I came to it, I was almost expecting choreographic creativity, which we got, but I think the kind of layering of the digital onto it also was fascinating, and I really loved that. And I think that your last piece, where we have different scenes or different boxes where we have your hands moving and we have your feet moving and we have different parts of your body, I thought was brilliant. And it reminded me actually of there's an anthropologist called Anne-Marie Moll, and she talks about the body multiple. And it's a story, actually she's Dutch, story, or it's a study of where she's in a hospital and she speaks to different specialists in a hospital who are all working on the same illness, but use different technologies to look at the body. And so they all look at the same body, but different parts of the body. And that they come up with very different ideas about what the body is. And so she talks about the body multiple is not just our lens into the body, but actually there are different understandings of what the body is. And I think your depiction of the different parts of the same body, but in different screens and in different kind of asynchronous kind of presentation really reminded me of that. How do we think about bodies? How do we see bodies? Through which lens are we looking at these bodies? And how do we grapple with that? And then finally, I think all of your pieces reminded me of readings we did in the month before in the decolonial feminist sex reading group, and in particular Theiya Hartman's book Wayward Lives. I'm going to get the title wrong, we can include the references, and I don't remember if we talked about this in our discussions when we met, but she's a she's an academic based in the US, and she looks at images, photos from the early 20th century in ghettos in northern the US, in a particular city. I can't remember if it's Chicago or Philadelphia, but there are images of women of color, and sometimes there are empty, people aren't in the images, and sometimes there are, and they're often taken by, at that point, social workers, police, and sociologists. She really doesn't like sociologists, and she imagines their stories outside of those photos. So what she does is she takes these photos and she writes the stories of the women in the photos that aren't visible within the photos, but happen, she imagines, outside of the photos. And she not only talks about how the photos depict vulnerability, but she finds strength and she finds agency, and that these women, these girls and women, live full lives in spite of living in abject poverty, in spite of the violence that they endure from the state and from the environment. And I think what your pieces have offered us are ways to see, to imagine what happens outside of those typical photos. What happens, what do women's bodies, what do they go through, what do they imagine, what do they do to get to that final stage? So those are just my few thoughts. So thank you very much for your work, and for making me think about what the visual allows us to see and what it doesn't allow us to see. So what work we need to do to move beyond that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid.
It was amazing. Thank you.
Thanks, Ingrid. That's going to be hard to follow. But I think I'm going to maybe start with one thing you said, which was really also stayed with me, which was the use of the digital, because I'm more used to seeing performance pieces on stage, and that's a very different kind of experience. There are lots of sort of sense-based experiences that you get from being in an audience and seeing something on stage, including the smell of the place and so on and so forth, which is something, of course, that you don't have if you're watching a piece online. And over the lockdown, I've been watching quite a bit of theater and performances online as well. And some of the pieces, like Akram Khan's Until the Lions, for example, was reimagined to be seen online. But again, that's a very different experience to the experience I had watching your piece, because here the digital kind of effects really acted as almost another actor, or even another. Sometimes it felt like another actor, and sometimes it felt like another member of the audience I might be having a conversation with while watching the piece. So I really, really enjoyed that. I wanted to maybe talk about 3 themes that for me were really sort of palpable and important. The first one is, unfortunately, maybe not the happiest one, and perhaps a trigger warning is worthwhile here, because I would be talking about assault and so on. So the first theme is the question of covering and uncovering, especially in relation to violence such as assault and rape, but also uncovering as a form of resistance, right? So for example, with Himadri's photo shoot, in relation to social expectations as to what you're expecting or expected to show versus what you are shown, and that's sort of not in your control, right? So it's you Himadri, choose what you're going to show us, and that's a form of control that you have, and that can be then transformed in terms of a form of resistance, right? And that really took me to the other spectrum of resistance, which was then reminded me of Mahashweta's Draupadi, again based on this flipping of Draupadi's uncovering as assault versus Dobdi in the fictional story, who is a Naxalite revolutionary who is raped by the police and then chooses to remain uncovered as a form of resistance, and appears in front of this of the carceral state, basically saying, here I am. What are you going to do about this? This is my resistance. Once I've lost everything, now what? Now what happens? And so that really sort of in my mind played together. And I was just reminded of this because I was reading Agnya Srinivasan's The Right to Sex, and she reminded me of the event around in 2004 in Manipur, where Tangam Manorama was abducted, tortured, and raped by the Indian Army, which was then followed by a protest by several women who came in front of the carceral state, decided to unstrip themselves, to come naked and say and chant, "Rape us, kill us." So this importance of the agent choosing what to cover and uncover as a form of resistance was really important for me. And I think sort of the performance is a really important part for me of that. The second theme that came across to me quite strongly was and this again goes in a very different direction, which was the importance of the ceremonial. And I think this for me was the strongest in your piece, Karen. Also, not just in terms of the movement, but also in terms of the pace and the music and the repetition and the going round in circle, in terms of the ceremonial aspects of clothing and unclothing and so on, and what you're preparing yourself for. And for some reason, perhaps this was not what you're thinking about at all when you were dancing, but this reminded me so strongly of all the discussions around PPE in the pandemic. So this made me think about, how healthcare workers and how doctors and nurses and those who care would every day have to come in and go through this ceremony of covering themselves in order to protect themselves and others and so on. And the importance of that repetitive ceremonial nature of clothing, of a certain kind of clothing, because you're definitely using a costume, right? So that has its own kind of implication, that has its own kind of association and expectations as to what then the audience sees or the patient sees, right? Or the patient doesn't see, because if you're if all you see of doctors are sort of, maybe eyes or their glasses through the PPE or the nurses and so on, and you don't really know who these people are, what their identities are, but they've spent the entire night, for example, trying to save you and so on. So that for me was, I think that brought home this idea of the ceremonial and so on. And the final theme I think I wanted to talk about is the breaking away from expectation and the expected use of, and this is clear in all of your pieces, but I think for me the strongest was, and maybe in some ways triggered in my mind, Nandini's piece around breaking away from the expected use of body, of movement. Also in terms of the use of sound and silence around the piece also was really important, because some of the sound wasn't what you'd expect when you see a performed piece, for example. And that was, the importance of discomfort in terms of expectation was, for me, came across really strongly. Also the gendered expectations of what you're wearing when you're dancing, versus what you might be wearing when you're practicing, or why is that? Why is there a huge difference between the perform versus the preparation and so on? And also some of the movements. There are some of the movements that are very clearly within established classical dance form versus some of the movements. I remember your feet going in a certain kind of movement, and that sort of allows a space for discomfort in terms of, oh, this is not what I expected to see in that, in the dance, but what that means around expectations of bodies and how they move and how they're used, especially gendered bodies and questions around femininity. And that made me think about another aspect of public health, which are beauty norms. So beauty norms are really quite important in terms of thinking about public health matters, the things we might do to our bodies to live up to the standards of beauties, but that beauty norms, and philosopher Heather Widdows talks about this, that beauty norms aren't just social norms, they're also moral norms, right? You're expected to be and a certain weight, you're expected to have certain curves. And what is your BMI exactly? Are you healthy? Why are you not healthy? Why are you not wearing your Apple Watch? And things like that. So that really pushed me towards thinking about how these norms are set and what we do and go about doing every day, thinking about whether we live up to the expectations of these norms and so on. And the huge amount of sort of both the beauty industry and the medical industry and the huge machinery behind some of these expectations and norms. So thank you very much for doing this work and allowing us to think about.
Thank you so much, Agnya. That was...
Yeah, I think it's evoked a lot.
Yes.
Both what Ingrid said and Agnya, you said, like, it's, I feel quite full at the moment. Yeah.
True. Yeah.
I mean, this is putting us, myself included, on the spot now. Perhaps if we have any reflections on what we've heard, maybe we could talk a little bit about our own thinking behind each of our pieces, and perhaps even how what we have heard has impacted on that. And Himatri, would you like to start?
Yeah. So before I start, I would like to say I'm a little shaken after Agya's response to it, mostly because it came so close. So it's just in my mind. So basically, when we were in the reading group, we did go through Spivak. We read other proper academic works and things like that. And I'm already using Spivak in my own research. But what really stuck with me was the fictional stories. And more so over what stuck with me was Draupadi. And I remember when we were in the reading group, I had this thought when she appears in front of the Carcinal, just like without any clothes. There was this thought in my mind that how bodies are actually used as a weapon. And what if you take away the shame from being without clothes, and suddenly you take away that weapon? But as soon as I thought it, I also remember it's not easy to take away the shame. So this whole creation of this piece was more like a personal experience of resistance, somewhat. Resistance that I defy a lot of rules. So people who might know me, I might come across as someone who chooses whatever I wear, however I like to. But just like the photo shoot, there is a lot that goes back in my mind. I do understand that if I am appearing, say, with a lot of my skin shown, I may be defying a lot of norms to be there, but I never leave the thought of the shame that is associated with it. The shame that comes in the sense of maybe someone who knows me is right now shaming me in their mind, or maybe just a stranger on the road. So this hyper attention to the body was the realization that I had after reading Draupadi, and what it actually is in me, that I might look like someone who defies the norms to a lot of people, and I try my level best. But those norms come back in the sense of there's a constant level of living with the idea that there is so much shame associated with it. There was another thing that I was thinking about it. Just give me a moment. It's just passed my mind. Yeah. When you were talking about the digital, so I think I used the idea of social media because I think it has become a society of its own right now. So we live in our world, but there's this little small world that goes on internet, right? And just like if I'm walking on road, I'm always acutely aware of all the eyes on me. Maybe not so much here, but especially when I lived in India. It's a similar feeling when you're watched and perceived on social media. There is this acute awareness of everything I do is being perceived by someone, is being judged by someone. And I don't have the liberty of just being. So that was where it came from, and listening to what it evoked in you, Agnya, and you, Ingrid, it just kind of left me a little, it just became too real. It wasn't so real, and I wasn't so accepting of this is the impact of it when I was just doing it, because it was a very mechanical process then. But yeah, thank you so much.
That's actually making me think of what Agor and Ingrid, both of you said about the kind of all three of those pieces put together. And something for me that's come up with all three of our pieces is the gaze. Since the beginning, since we started talking about the material from the reading group and started kind of thinking about what we might draw from it for our movement explorations, I think the gaze was such an important aspect of it. And I think particularly in your piece, for me, there was always the gaze, which was such an important driver of it, that it was about what you were showing, but for me it was also about what was being seen in that, the gaze of how the gaze impacts what you're showing. And I think that was very strongly there for me, I think. But I'll just continue with mine because some direct links to that. I think for me, my idea of thinking about gaze, but also thinking about being seen and not being seen. And when we were talking about being seen, like what was coming up for me was that kind of layers of visibility, but then also the inability to be seen. That kind of fantasy that we will be seen, but then we will never be seen without that gaze, without the external gaze, without the internal gaze, and all those things. So it's as much as it is about the showing and the showing and seeing, there is also the kind of loss for me in that fragmentation that probably I will never be fully seen. I will never be fully seen in what I'm trying to show. And to be really honest, a part of my piece was also resistance in the sense of performance. Like I've said this to both of you before, that kind of idea of when we say we are doing something as Indian classical dancers, and the things we hear of, oh, can you do some Indian classical dance? So my piece starts with an Indian classical dance because that is what is expected. For me, that was my resistance, that this is what you expect, but then what do you actually see was my question of what do I actually show you? What am I showing you if I do an Indian classical dance piece? And then what is, who am I in that? I think that was what I was going with, but then also inevitably, I think for me, it's like there's always fragmentation. Whatever I want to show, whatever you see, there's always a loss in that it will be beneath those layers. Can
I just add something? So one thing I really found very interesting in your piece, I don't know how many people have seen it, or I don't know if it's an experience. So when I was a kid, when we used to lose connection, we used to get those white things. So that was always a sense of, oh my God, it's gone. That's exactly how I felt with your piece. It's like, I was watching you. And it's gone. You took it away from me. Yeah. So that feeling of loss was very evident to that.
Yeah. And I sometimes I feel my bit kind of contrasts from yours, because I go the other way. I want to hide, and the ceremonial, you kind of what you said, Ago, about the importance of the ceremonial. And for me, it's the feeling, so that the constant yearning for belonging, so the longing to belong, the longing to just be as I am without having to hide. And I think I connected it. Well, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about both of the pieces that we read, the quilt and the Draupadi piece, because they in a way contrasted each other. And so my piece was about how do I feel that I can belong, and for me it's hiding under the costume, so that from the outside it can be appearing in a certain way, but still struggling with finding my place. And I think, Ingrid, what you were saying about what lies behind the visual, that's it. The visual, once we get into the costume and it's there, that's kind of almost like the screen, the mask is put in place, and then I am not seen, my costume is seen. So there was that, but sorry, I'll go, ever since you said this about the PPE, this is all that I can have in my head, because It is so true. I am now thinking about me as I put on all of this rigmarole, and everybody who needs to wear PPE, because probably they also go through a very similar process of, they have the order that they put things on, it needs to be done in a particular way. There is that ceremonial feel to it, and they do become like they lose some of their identity, and yeah, suddenly the visual of what people see is different. Yeah, that was a really interesting reflection, actually. Yeah, I liked that, which is, it was completely, I mean, I really didn't expect it. I didn't think of that at all.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
I also saw something which I did not notice before when we did this is, so you get on to the full ceremonial process of becoming an Indian classical dancer, and we end there that you're still figuring out your place and identity, and then you just directly start with already being an Indian classical dancer. Yeah, so it's just like you are trying to build that identity, but it's like that's how you appear, and your identity is marked in that space. That just felt very contrasting, very interesting to see that there.
One of the things that I was thinking about as you were all speaking was these ideas that both Ingrid and I are quite interested in are issues around epistemic. I mean, we like to think about epistemic injustice and so on, and this is where I think arts-based methods or this interdisciplinarity is really, for me, really interesting, because when we talk about this, when we talk about epistemic authority or epistemic ignorance, or all these aspects, when we think about it in terms of academic work, we often talk about language, we talk about words, at the most we might talk about voice. I don't often see myself thinking about what is seen and unseen, right? In the same way, I don't use those terms very much, because of course I'm thinking about language and the written language, and at the most read around or spoken language, but I'm not thinking about the visual as much. And I think that's so important when you're talking about visibility and invisibility, and choosing to be visible, choosing to be less visible. And I can't remember, maybe Ingrid, who is a Black feminist, talking about how brown and Black women entering into a room are both hyper visible and invisible at the same time, right? So you're both set apart, but also people assume certain epistemic authority or lack of epistemic authority within that room. And the contrast of that for you, Karen, which is in order to potentially also overcome judgments of things like cultural appropriation and so on, where the ceremonial then becomes really important to show the epistemic authority, the epistemic knowledge that actually I do belong. I know enough. This is not just me making stuff up and things like that. So I think that the sort of the visual aspect of the epistemic for me was, as you spoke about it, became very important. I don't know, Ingrid, if that's something that also came to mind.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting observation. I don't know the name of a Black feminist, that probably quite a few talk about the kind of hypervisibility and erasure at the same time of women of color or Black and brown women. I think what you raise around epistemic injustice or justice is really interesting. And I've been having conversations with Ago digitally, offline, around how we think about communities and how that injustice can be turned around to recognize what agency is there, what possibilities are there, what are the possibilities of resistance to that injustice. And I think that, and I don't know if I'm perhaps going off on a tangent here, but I do wonder about coming back to what Himadri, you said about resistance, and actually I think all of you have talked about resistance in some way, really. So what is it that, do we recognize what you're allowed to know and say, and how you're challenging that through your bodies? So maybe the words you use or aren't listened to are different to what you're doing with your bodies, and actually thinking about the weight, the kind of weight on particular bodies, of the kind of violence, of the kind of exploitation, of the being erased but still, you know, having demands made of you. I think it's really interesting. I don't know where this is going, but I think, Ago, your point about what do we mean by justice here, how can we, what does that, how do you work towards that, what would it look like? And I was listening to so Aga was talking about epistemic injustice, which did Miranda Fricker, did she coin that phrase, or did she's written about it quite extensively?
I think she might have coined the
specific
phrase of epistemic injustice, even though many authors, especially women of color and Black feminists, have written about the concept.
Yeah. So which is also an interesting kind of who gets a credit, you know, the credit for coining a phrase, and when people, and which is why in our reading group we wanted to read contemporary authors around decolonization, but also recognizing all of the work that's been done. But I think I was listening to a talk that she gave where she was thinking about what would epistemic equality look like. And I have to be honest, I didn't finish the talk. I went on to something else, but thinking about, well, what is it that we're working towards? What can we imagine we want this to look like? But I think, where is it that, do we have to first share story? And when I say we, I mean we in that general sense. Do stories need to be shared and heard before we get to what that equality might look like, or justice is a better kind of probably phrase? But I think that's a really interesting reflection about what is known, what epistemic justice could look like in relation to how bodies are used, are moved, how they move around, how they can be tools of resistance or forms of resistance. So
I think there's lots to think about there, and it's whirling around in my head. But perhaps to conclude this webcast, we could have a little chat about why we think projects like this are relevant, and actually what we would like to achieve with this project. Would anyone like to start us off?
I mean, I suppose all of us kind of spoke a little bit about that, bridging that gap in our own different ways. Like Ago and Ingrid, you spoke about how for you arts-based research kind of widens that that the boundaries of kind of what you do and what you think about in academia. And for us, it kind of bridges that space between how we engage with people and what kind of material we engage with. But I suppose for me, I'm also now thinking about the conversation we are just having, and it's not just about the piece we have created or the material, but then also the dialogue that's coming up from it. And just even I know we've barely scratched the surface. Like I was just thinking, talking about epistemic injustice and epistemic justice, I could speak for hours about from both like really pessimistic views of epistemic justice is quite unachievable to how do we fight for it, and where that fight comes from. And I think we've barely scratched the surface, but I think for me it goes into that need for dialogue and what can come up from the dialogue, and the kind of things that we need to be talking about at this moment, not just from in academia or just in activism, but quite generally how we can broaden the dialogue in that. I think for me that's that's what this project is about for me, and I hope that is what we will achieve, even if it's just beginning to.
To just bounce off Nandini, I think as we want to eventually not just keep this as researchers and performers and choreographers and creators, the whole intention is to talk to more and more people, like not just call them audience, but everyone who engages with this will have a little part of themselves that they can bring into this. And this word has been coming into my mind, and I almost feel like I don't want to say it, but it's there, so I'm going to say it. It's like it's almost starting a movement which already is in place. I'm not saying we are the ones who are starting it, but I believe by let's say, bringing like-minded people together, and maybe those who are not like-minded, give them something to think about, to encourage more and more people to have dialogue, whether for it, against it, with us, without us, but bringing as many people as we can and start to talk and be heard if possible. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, it's also about, the importance of this is also about really trying to push at the boundaries of what we think, how we should create knowledge, who gets to create knowledge and how, right? Because even though in academia, in research, you have a lot of freedom in terms of what you think about, what you're going to work on, there are still very well established standards and norms around how that knowledge is put together, how it's expressed, right? It has to be written in, or spoken in a certain way. It has to appear in certain journals, and that's how knowledge is created. Whereas that's really very restrictive in terms of, especially if we think about justice, that's a very restrictive way of thinking about and doing justice, right? And I think Nandini and I were talking about this yesterday, about how even thinking about scholarship, and how if, for example, women's movements that are sort of on the ground are not written about or spoken about, suddenly they're not part of the scholarship anymore, and they don't become part of the knowledge, and that's really problematic, right? So
because it doesn't fit into
it doesn't
how
fit in,
yeah
and how knowledge is created and how knowledge is distributed and who gets to do it. Because if you don't have the skills, or you haven't had the sort of the disciplinary background to know how to write an academic text, then you don't become a creative knowledge anymore. I feel like, Ingrid, you want to jump in?
Well, I do, because I think it's also about, I think sometimes this knowledge is used by, so one of the critiques in a lot of work is that this knowledge that is understood, that is experienced at a grassroots level, a community level, is often taken up by white global north researchers and written about, and we get the kudos for it because we can write and we can publish in these journals, but actually the people whose experiences are we're talking about don't get anything from these academic journals. So what is the benefit for them of being a part of this work? And I think it's something that I and colleagues need to really reflect on, is why is it we're doing this work, and how can we learn from kind of these communities without exploiting, without extracting. It's a very colonial practice that continues, the extraction of knowledge and the extraction of value from communities within whom or from whom we wouldn't have this. But so it's just me thinking about the role of academia, the role of people who are not within these communities. And I don't want to create boundaries. Do you know what I mean? I think it can be problematic to create boundaries, but whose voices are we listening to, and how are we hearing those voices, and who is it that is shaping how we're hearing those voices? A little bit like the photographs, right? How are we seeing the visual? Who is doing that kind of editing? Anyway,
I think that brings us right back to Spivak and the idea of subaltern. And like, I think what's coming up for me is something I read of subaltern, women are subaltern, but then also even in that, like, for example, Dalit women, and can we speak for Dalit women as we speak of Indian feminisms, for example? And then what happens to like the same way you said, Ingrid, about global north academic researchers talking about global south feminisms, the same way it's also upper caste Indian feminists talking about Dalit feminist movements. And I think the cycle just continues. And I think we're just coming straight back to that kind of idea of Spivak and subaltern, and can the subaltern speak, and but can the subaltern be heard? And I think it just took me right back to that.
Spivak herself being a caste feminist, right, and also having been criticized for speaking for others. So it's I think it's part of an exercise that all of us have to think about and
True.
continue working on.
Yeah.
But can I just say, not to have the last word as the white global north researcher, I'm really interested in how these dialogues, I don't know if I'm delusional and this is not, this is not possible, but are there different ways of having dialogues that can challenge those structures, or are we still within a certain space, and do you have to address everything? Can you make attempts? So how can we resist the structures that determine that we maintain these hierarchies, right? So does this dialogue, does our conversations, and continued conversations and opening up to others, does it begin to challenge it, or should I just be quiet and pass the mic to others? So just a question about form and about what, and this is where I think the arts does offer real possibilities. It's open to it opens up possibilities of how we engage with each other and what we hear and what we can see, I think.
I think those are pretty good final words.
Yes. There's a lot to think about.
Yeah, and I mean, we don't have much time, but yeah, that could have been another 1 hour conversation.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.